for intelligent people, I don't know what possessed you to produce that thing there. I'm not worried that it's a skirt, but who in their right mind is going to place an order for that? It's like Jordan in his Technicolor nightmare. That's what that is.
Look, I get that, and I take full accountability for it. I was trying to really push the boat out. In hindsight, it was too risky and it's too niche.
So niche, yeah, hard to sell, I would say.
Yeah.
Looks like Lady Gaga's laundry basket. And then you got Liam, despondency.
I thought that the whole task was about, you know, upcycling, and that for me was a very strong message. That's why I wanted to be the project manager, to get them points across.
Yeah,
and Jordan
I heard
had
you
this
wanted
whole
to be the
story.
project manager. I think I've heard it 20 times.
Sorry, Lord Sugar.
Okay, I don't need to hear it anymore. You wasn't the project manager. The point is that when you're in a team, you've got to back the team. You have to back it and stop moaning, you know? So who chose Express Up?
So Anissa chose it. Obviously, I was the sub-team
Sounds
leader.
like a super fast Viagra.
Yeah, I mean, look, I did...
Yeah, I kept, with the naming, what we were going for is expressing yourself from upcycled fashion. And that was the meaning behind it.
One of the messages that Jordan did convey in the briefing is to create something bold, bright, vibrant, and the brief on that aspect was not met.
We used neon colours for it. I don't know what else more we could have done to make it look more vibrant.
Where does the failure of this task lay then?
I think the failure is down to the nicheness of the products. I think Mia was the one who was pushing to go for a niche product. I understand her reasoning in terms of fashion, but it doesn't make business sense. So I think it does lie in the design team.
Look, in hindsight, I probably should have stuck to my guns and gone with something potentially more traditional. But I think as project manager, you need to be collaborative. You have to listen to your whole team.
Who do you think the failure of this task lays with then?
Honestly, I feel like Liam had limited input on day one, and that's just not good enough at this stage of the process.
You know, I feel like on day one, I was naturally a little bit disappointed. But what I will say, Lord Sugar, is I still put suggestions out there.
See, one of the things I can't get my head around is, in a team, despondency, near to what I would call sabotage, if you like. And that's the kind of message I got back about you, Liam.
I do feel that I did put in an effort in the day one. You know, I was in the video, I made contributions to names, and I feel like I've done a lot in this task.
Well, I have to work on my instincts, really.
Lord Sugar, if I may.
No, just be quiet a minute. Liam, I can't really forgive anybody for not giving their all.
I feel
no
like
matter how bad
did
it
give,
is.
I definitely did give my all, Lord Sugar.
Well,
I made the...
What I've heard, you didn't. And so it is with regret, Liam, that you're fired.
Thank you, Lord Sugar.
Baroness Brady.
You, Anissa, have been in the losing team 8 times. So tell me why I shouldn't fire you.
But there's a reason I'm still here. Each task, I've been a key contributor. I've not been the failure of the task. I've always shown resilience. I've always shown I'm adaptable, and I've always given it my best.
Jordan, why shouldn't I fire you?
Look, Sugar, I think throughout this entire process, week in, week out, I've been improving. When it comes to my business, I came from nothing similar to yourself. I am great at team building. I'm great in getting the most out of my teammates.
Do you think Liam would agree, would he?
Well, look, I think with Liam, he just wasn't getting on board. But if that was my business and someone didn't get on board with the vision, they'd be gone. That's the reality of it. I work with people who buy into me as a person.
And Mia, why shouldn't I fire you?
You know, I've put myself in positions of risk. You know, I've shown in this process I've got strong sales acumen. I recognise I am largely at fault for the loss, but I'm really proud of what I've achieved in the process.
Well, I'm going to have to conclude now. Nia, you are right that you've done a bit of selling in the past, but it's not just the selling. And Anissa, you haven't been very successful in the process so far. And so regretfully, Anissa, you know, I have to consider.
If I may, I would say what I have shown is hard work.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know
Look, Anissa,
Yeah,
please,
sorry.
I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Okay.
Everybody works hard. Jordan, you've worked your way up the ladder in this process, and I've been quite impressed with the manner in which you present yourself. And so you're going to be in the final 5, okay?
Thank you, Lord Sugar.
Don't let me down.
I won't.
Right. So, regretfully, Mia, I have to say that you were responsible overall for the disaster of these designs, and therefore, I'm sorry to say that you're fired.
No problem. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've loved every single bit of it. Thank you, Baroness Brady. Thank you, Tim.
Good luck, Mia.
Thank you.